Okay, so thank you to everybody who completed their end of topic test for the development gap. What I'm going to do is run through some feedback. So I've put together a presentation with the questions, the mark scheme, and then some model answers as well, so that you can see what you should be working towards and what a good answer looks like. Um, the purpose of this is so that you can go back through your answers and you can look and see perhaps what yours was missing, what you could have added, how you could have improved. So, what you should be doing is watching this presentation and then doing a little bit of dirt around your own test. Um, a lot of the feedback in this is around kind of geographic skills. So, how do we show um, a, a clear understanding of something, or how do we analyze a map, or something like that? So, this will also help you in future tests and throughout the next couple of years. Um, so, getting into it. The first question, using figure 4, compare HDI values in Africa and South America. Um, you can at any point pause this video so that you can read the information on the slide, and particularly when we start looking at some of the answers as well. So this question was looking for you to focus on the differences in them. So we're only looking at Africa, we're only looking at South America, um, and I think that almost everybody managed to identify that HDI values are higher in South America than they are in Africa. We know that because the darker blue colours represent higher HDI values. HDI is measured 0 to 1, so the higher the HDI number, the kind of more developed a country is. A few people managed to identify, in particular, Central Africa has quite low HDI scores. If you're going to be making statements like that, you need to remember really explicitly to use the data from the key as well. So here we've got a couple of model answers that the mark scheme has given us. So you just identified that HDI values in South America are generally higher than in Africa. You would have got a point. If you had done that and included some of the data from the key, that's also worth a mark. But what we're looking for to get full marks for this is for you to start almost analysing some of the information. So what they've done here is that the highest figures for HDI are in the extreme north and south of Africa, so that's where we've got these darker blues, showing values exceeding 0.6, so using the key. The highest in South America are in the southern part, with values above 0.8. So they've identified the general trends. They've also started talking about some specific data, and they're using specific data from the map. So that's including naming places and using the information in the key. So what did this look like in practice? This is what we call a waggle, what a good one looks like. It's taken from the test. All of the model answers that we're going to look at today have been taken directly from the test. So, as you can see in figure 4, HDI values in parts of Africa, such as Chad, Niger, Rwanda, have an HDI of less than 0.5, whereas in South America, the HDI values are quite high. And in HICs, like Argentina and Chile, they have an HDI value of more than 0.8. In Africa, they have a lower HDI, that should say, since more countries are less developed than countries in South America. Um, and if anything, I think that going into the exam for 4-mark questions, you'd only want to spend 4 minutes on them. So you could probably cut out that last sentence, because the focus here is on using that specific data. So looking at what you can get from the key, which are the figures, using specific country names to identify and really locate what you're talking about. But also the general trend in that Africa has lower HDI values on average than South America. So that answer got a full 2 marks. Moving on. Outline one disadvantage of using a single measure of development, such as income. So you didn't have to only talk about income or GNI, but lots of people did. And the kind of the core of this question is getting you to talk about why that is misleading. Um, so I know we talked about it lots in my classes, and I saw it come through lots. People recognise that GNI is an average calculation. It doesn't take into account extreme wealth or extreme poverty in the country. Remember you can talk about that. So if you just say that it's an average, then you're going to get 1 mark. But if you say it doesn't take into account other factors, that will get you 2 marks. So we've got a couple of suggested answers that have been identified in the mark scheme. So a single measure may only measure the economic state of a country. Combined measures such as HDI take into account social indicators such as education levels. And that answer also has some quite good geographic vocabulary in there, if that's something that you think that you need to be working on. The second example that they've used, using one measure can be misleading because it's average for a country, e.g. Saudi Arabia, where GNI is high, but most of the country is held by very few extremely rich people. So that's quite good because in here they've used a specific case study to support their point as well. In the test, we've got on the right-hand side here 2 answers that were given in the test from some students. So only using one measure like GNI per head only looks at money and the economic development of a country. Using a more mixed measure like HDI takes into account both social and economic. So that's highlighted the disadvantage and then talked about a way that you can get around it, or an alternate option. So that answer received the full 2 marks. And the second one, there is a possibility that the country all have high incomes, but the healthcare system is very bad and they have a very high death rate. So it isn't guaranteed to show how developed a country is. So this one could have been worded slightly better. It could have had some more targeted language. But what it's essentially saying is that if you only look at GNI, you can't guarantee that it's not an average. You can't guarantee that the rest of the country is as developed. If we think about corruption in particular, where people might look like they have high incomes, but the money isn't being spent on the local infrastructure, so the country isn't in practice as developed as you'd think it might be on paper. So that answer also received 2 marks. And I've included this one just for you also to see that that sometimes if you can't remember how to necessarily word something, if you can't think about using GNI or HDI or start talking about social economic indicators, that's okay. You can still get full marks. Obviously, geographic vocabulary is the end point, and for the longer form answers, that we do look for that. But for these shorter answers, don't stress too much if you can't remember all of these keywords, especially not at this point. So, suggest 2 ways that the level of economic development of a country might affect the quality of life for its people. So, this one we're looking for 2 points and 2 explanations. And you can either talk about positive or negative. So you can talk about a high level or a low level of economic development and the impact that that would have um, on somebody's quality of life, um, or the quality of life of the people who live there. What mark schemes often do is they give you what's called indicative content, which is answers that we expect that will be given. You obviously you can give answers outside this as well, but this is the sort of stuff that we're expecting to see. So I've got two examples here. Again, you can pause the video and have a read through of them. But they both received full marks. And the first answer, it's a good answer because it talks about healthcare and education. It gives a reason for why healthcare and education um, are quite closely linked to development and how improving them can improve people's quality of life and can improve the development of a country. Initially reading this, this is because if there is not good healthcare and people are sick all the time, then they won't be able to work. That isn't really what I would call a development. I wouldn't really say that point's been explained very well, but what they've done here is after they've talked about education, they've then linked it back and talked about the importance of being able to work so people pay taxes so that they can fund more healthcare and education. And what they've done here is they've highlighted that development is an ongoing process, it's a cycle. And so if you are investing in education and healthcare, then it's going to have really good future impacts as well. So the second answer that we've got here, we firstly got a focus on the individual's quality of life. So it says if there's more employment, people will have a steady income, meaning that they'll buy more luxuries, maybe afford better accommodation. So it talks about kind of taking it away from the more easily defined indicators to the kind of quality of life of that, like personal safety and happiness and freedom. But then they link it really well back to the overall country's development. They've said that if they've got a high level of development, there'll be more money that can be used for the country, and I assume that means for infrastructure, because they then go on to talk about investment in public buildings such as schools and hospitals. As a result of a school, this means that a child can get an advanced education, meaning more jobs become available to them, which may have a higher income. So all I would say here, and it's only a 4-mark question, so it doesn't need a lot of development, but all I would say here is perhaps linking that final statement back to increased taxes, which could then pay for the money to be invested. But that's more if we're looking at a 6-mark question. So if we go back to the mark scheme, the first question talked about improvement to healthcare, so wider provision of medical services and access to education. And the second question talked about increased access to education and also improvements to infrastructure. So those are both 4-mark answers. This question tripped a lot of people up. Explain the relationship between conflict and uneven development. In this situation, conflict means war. And so that's what we're talking about. And it's asking you to explain how conflict can cause uneven development and how uneven development can cause conflict. So we've got a little mark scheme on the side that shows if you gave a detailed answer, you'll get either 5 or 6 marks, a clear answer 3 to 4, and basic answer 1 to 2. And we've got some indicative content here. So conflict causes uneven development because tax revenue and resources are being used to fund the conflict rather than infrastructure. We've got conflict leads to international migration because refugees flee their country for a safer environment, which means that skilled workers are leaving. It means that there's fewer people in the country to help rebuild or maintain the economy. And also, other countries are unlikely to invest in a country that is currently undergoing conflict which means that they're not getting that foreign revenue as well. Um, and what you could have used here was the Syrian refugee crisis, because we looked at that when we looked at migration. So we've got here two model answers, and they're quite different with the arguments that they've made. Now, I should say here, the first question got 6 marks and the second question got 5, and I'll explain why that is as I go through them. So the first question shows that somebody's actually done a little bit of extra research about Syria and about the Syrian refugee crisis. The civil war in Syria, which is great. So they've said their first point is that conflict can cause social infrastructure to be destroyed. They've given a really clear example. So 50% of social infrastructure in Syria was non-operational, it wasn't working, it was destroyed. And so this left many people without jobs and many children without school. And then they've linked it back to not only the government, but also people's quality of life. And then what's been done really, really nicely here, we often talk about, how do we do the L in PL, how do we link? And it talks about the negative effect of social infrastructure destruction on the quality of life. And then it goes, as quality of life deteriorates, many Syrians left Syria. And that starts to talk about refugee crisis and about what happens to having fewer people in the country and being able to do important work. And also there's just fewer people to kind of have children and try and boost the population in that way as well. So this answer uses examples really clearly and effectively to prove their point. So by telling me about Syria and using these details about Syria, what the student has done is they've proved to me that they know what they're talking about, because they've given me examples of where they've seen it happen. And when we ask for specific examples, that's what we're talking about, not just such as Syria and they're not coming back to it, but using the Syrian example to highlight how migration can cause, how conflict can lead to migration, which can cause uneven development. This second answer here, what it does really clearly is it makes some points and it explains them really, really well. And so they've demonstrated a detailed knowledge of development and conflict, and they've also shown a thorough understanding of the links between conflict and development, because they've explained all the answers well, basically. So conflict will have a huge impact on the government because it will cost them lots to rebuild. So that's using money to pay for the conflict. So the government won't have enough money to provide education, healthcare, food, and shelter. So that's the money that would usually go into infrastructure isn't going there. Additionally, individuals lose jobs, access to education and health, which means that they don't get that revenue. And that they're not able to continue to provide for the future generations in the country as well. And then furthermore, other sources of income such as tourism stop. So that's good because that links to the kind of wider how do we reduce the development gap in a country, or tourism, but you can't do that if you've got conflict. And then they talk about skilled workers such as doctors and teachers migrating. And the only thing I would say is around the migration stuff, you can probably link in Syria to add to it, or just slightly more development around the impact of not having social infrastructure such as education, health services, and shelter for people. So this question got 5 out of 6 because it is, if we go back to the mark scheme, it is very detailed, but it could just have a little bit more around AO2, so this thorough understanding of the links between conflict and development. But those are both good answers. And so we've got a 6 at the top and a 5 at the bottom. State 2 challenges faced by people living in the area described in Figure 7. So, apologies for those that this didn't load or it was too small for. It seemed very hit and miss. But for this one, you got 1 mark for mentioning any of the following, and I've circled the 4 in the text that you should have been looking for. They've also accepted lack of transport or limited healthcare, so it's quite generic statements which sum up what is talked about here. Um, they're not looking for childbirth as a leading cause of death. Nothing in Figure 7 suggests that. It's quite a bold claim. Um, and then some people use the picture as well. I can see how that would have happened. So when we talk about Figure 7, when they ask about Figure 7, they are talking about the whole thing, including the text that they give as well. So some people talked about climate-related challenges or references to the bicycle ambulances specifically, but we're just looking for literally what it says in the text. And sometimes they'll put in questions like this, and you'll think, no, that's too easy. It can't possibly be those, so I'll look for something a bit more. And that's not the case. They just want to know how well you can read and understand what you've read and then repeat it back. So, continuing with intermediate technology, one characteristic of intermediate technology. So I saw lots of the definition of intermediate technology, that it is sustainable, small scale, and appropriate for the needs of the local people. Um, what we're really looking for is that they are simple and affordable, because that's what makes them appropriate for the needs of the local people. That they can allow people to develop businesses or to earn money, or that it involves the local community. So it's kind of an organic grassroots development rather than say relying on international aid or something like that. Also, if you worded it so you're kind of contrasting it against other technologies, if you had said it's not expensive, it's not complicated, anything like that, you would have got that. Um, if you just said it was sustainable, if you just said it was appropriate, if you just said it was environmentally friendly or it suited the environment, it was still quite vague. Um, what we're looking for, um, it needs to show, as it says here, how intermediate technology can be appropriate for poorer countries. So you're really making that link that intermediate technology is used by LICs as a simple and affordable um, method to either develop business or earn money. Okay. Moving on, using Figure 6 and your own understanding, suggest how growth of tourism in an LIC or NEE might help to reduce the development gap. And then we've got Figure 6 here, which shows a multiplier effect. And kudos to the person who referenced the multiplier effect in their answer. Well done. So here's the mark scheme. What it says here, so we're testing your ability to be able to use the evidence that you've been given, and you get 2 marks for that. So that's where it says AO3. So to get your first mark for that, you can either use Figure 6 or you can use your own knowledge, and to just basically talk about the link between tourism and reducing the development gap. So how can tourist revenue reduce the development gap? To get the the second mark for that, you have to use Figure 6 effectively. So you have to use it rather than just mentioning it. You have to use it to really support your statement. But the thing with Figure 6 is that this first point here, it says it only needs to be slight. So if you didn't necessarily say in figure 6, but you used some of the phrases that are in these boxes, you still got those 2 marks as long as you used it effectively. You didn't have to use a case study for this, and it's only 4 marks. So you didn't have to go into a heck of a lot of detail. But what you didn't get any credit for, and what I think will be quite frustrating for some people going through the answers, is basically if you just described what what this is saying, you didn't get any credit for it. What The way that I imagine it is that you look at this and then you're explaining what the next box along would be. So how would increased income for government spending, what would the next box look like if we were talking about reducing the development gap? What would that money be spent on? How would that money be used to reduce the development gap? And how would that money be used, and how would that achieve reducing the development gap? So we've got 2 here. I will say the second one's a little bit long, but it's really robust. But we just need to remember you should spend about a minute per mark. You don't have a long time in a lot of these tests, and so the quicker and the kind of more succinct we can be in our language, which I know I can waffle at times, so I'm not one to judge, but the quicker and more succinct we can be in our written work, then the more chance we'll have of being able to get through the whole thing and have time to edit it afterwards. So the first response: the growth of tourism in LIC or NEE, such as Jamaica, has had an economic impact on the country. It's because visitors from overseas are supporting local businesses by spending money. Figure 6 shows this leads to an increase in taxes. So if it had just been that, I would have thought, oh, not, that's probably not a 4. But then because they've developed it to say, meaning the government can invest in better healthcare, education, overall quality of life, which helps to reduce the development gap. And now this got a 4, but I would say that to really solidify it, just in case you come across quite a hard marker, you could have added something in there about how that would increase the HDI, which helps to reduce the development gap, or which increases a country's development. But you've got it there. And the second one, this one I gave 4 marks to as well. It hasn't used the figure. So I'll put this one in here so you could see what it meant when it says that use of figure 6 might only be slight, such as a term that's used in the figure. So a lot of these first 2 lines use the language that's in here. And so that counts as an effective use of figure 6, because what they've basically done is said, this is figure 6. All of this will result in increased income for government spending, and then they really develop the impact of increased income for the government spending. So this student has really clearly identified how over time, increasing the number of well-paid jobs, and education and better healthcare can improve the standard of living, and it will help it develop more, and that over time this will reduce the development gap. So this answer, although it's a little bit long, and that's more of a time concern, it has really clearly linked all of the points back to tourism being used to reduce the development gap. Okay, figure 7. Again, we had a few issues with this image where a few people weren't able to see it really clearly. Using figure 7 to compare the percentage of the price received by the fair trade banana producer. So this is a fair trade banana down here. It's got a fair trade sticker. Just looking at this bit here, where it says banana producer 14%, banana producer 7%. It was one of these two answers. If you said the fair trade producer receives 14% while the non-fair trade producer only receives 7, you got your mark. Fair trade producers receive double that of a non-fair trade producer. You didn't even have to use these figures, but you weren't given credit if you said the fair trade producer receives more, because it's not really comparing the percentage. If you only gave me one percentage, that's not a comparison. And if you use, say, retail sales, or you started bringing in other other figures, you got no credit for that. Again, this is another question where it looks like on the face of it they're trying to trip you up, but actually they're just trying to see how well you can read data that's been presented in a slightly different way. Outline one way that fair trade helps to deal with the problems of unequal development. So again, there's 2 points. Farmers give fair trade. Before I get into that, so it's 2 points, 2 marks. So you just need to make a statement and develop it. So the indicative content that they've given is that it gives farmers a guaranteed price for their products, and the profits from those fair wages are spent in the country. So it increases tax revenue, or that it goes back into local development projects, and that's kind of the development there. And then I've got 2 WAR goals on the right here. So fair trade ensures that the farmers that produce the crops get paid. Oh, someone needs to work on that. A fair price for the sale of their crop, allowing farmers to pay taxes. They provide the locals with better infrastructure. So here I've given the student the benefit of the doubt, and I assume that they means taxes. So the taxes can provide better infrastructure for the locals. Fair trade helps to deal with the problems of uneven development because it ensures people are paid enough money so they have access to food, water, housing at least. They can also help many people so they can have better education and healthcare. So again, because we've got access to food, water, and housing, then people can start to afford better education and healthcare as well. So when we talk about development, that's what it looks like. You've stated the first point, and then you've just given a little bit more detail. We've turned that on its head. So now one reason why fair trade schemes are not always successful, for this, you needed to make the link to fair trade really, really clear. If you said that sometimes their living conditions aren't safe or they don't get paid a fair wage, you need to be really clear what you're talking about, because that's a really specific example. If you're just saying that, then actually that doesn't tell me why fair trade isn't good. That tells me why agriculture and LICs is not good. So what we're looking for here, often the price of fair trade products are more expensive, or large companies, and we haven't looked at transnational corporations, not in any depth yet. They may control the production of a commodity, which means that there might be a larger company that produces the production of, say, cocoa beans, which means that they have less opportunity to introduce fair trade schemes for a number of reasons. So we've got that represented in the WAR goals on the right. So firstly, products are often more expensive so that farmers can get a fair share, and then companies and individuals are less likely to buy them. And then we've got that many companies not many companies use fair trade schemes, and sometimes fair trade products cost more in supermarkets, making it harder to sell. So we're quite a high success rate with this one because people could identify that fair trade is usually quite expensive for the consumer. So for us, if we want to buy it. Okay. Outline one way in which international aid has had an impact on a named LIC or NEE. Again, so you had to make a point and you had to develop it. If you made a really valid point, but you didn't name a country, then you only got 1 mark because it says really clearly on a named LIC or NEE country. And you didn't have to tell me whether that country was an LIC or NEE. You just had to name the country that you were talking about, and then the impact the aid has had on it. So the 2 examples that we've studied were represented really well in the answers. So firstly, Pakistan received £338 million from the UK, which was spent on education infrastructure to reduce hunger and poverty. So we've got really clearly a named example, and we've got the impact on it. And then the second one, we've talked about goat aid. We've got our named example, Malawi, and then the impacts. They're now able to have a source of income and a food source. And then this person has even developed it further to link it back to quality of life and development. So that's what we're looking for there, a named example and also the impact. Right, we're nearly there, guys. So the last question. Evaluate the effectiveness of a strategy to reduce the development gap that you have studied. Now, for those of you that have been keeping up with the quizzes, you may have been expecting a question like this because I have been giving you questions like this, evaluating the strategies that we have studied. And so it was good to see there was quite a lot more use of specific case studies in these answers than we've been seeing. So that shows really clear development, and it was really impressive. So the what we're looking for in this one is detailed knowledge of places and processes relating to development and reducing the development gap. So that's kind of how these strategies work. So you need to know like what the development gap is, how these strategies work, and about like where they're happening. Or kind of what these what the strategies are, because the second assessment objective that tells us how the strategy can reduce the development gap. So because it says a thorough understanding, this is where it comes under, how does it close the development gap? Yes or no? How does it, or why doesn't it? And then this final, and where has it worked? So AO2 is where we're looking for your case studies to really shine through. And then AO3 is how well you can apply your knowledge, so how well you can apply all of this to make a really thorough evaluation on the effectiveness of a strategy. And this is a really open question, okay, because you can decide whether or not it's effective, and you have complete control over which of the 8 strategies you're going to talk about. So you had a lot of freedom with this. A good way to think about these longer form questions, so like these 9 marks, is that you basically get a mark for every point that you make. That's not always the case, so don't take that as gospel, but if you're struggling with these longer answers, think about there's usually 3 marks for your knowledge, so what you know, so that's your points, and there's 3 marks for case studies. So if you don't give a case study, if you don't give a specific case study, you don't give detail from it, and you only maybe talk about something quite generally, you're really only going to get one mark, because a limited understanding. of your case study. Similarly, when you're asked to evaluate or maybe assess or talk about the extent which something does something, that's what AO3 is testing. So you get 3 marks for your ability to evaluate. So if all you've done is talk about your strategy and how it closes it. If you just said this is the strategy, it closes the development gap. And you've not actually offered any evaluation, again, you're only likely to have got 1 mark. Or you might have received no marks for that. So each of these represents 1 mark. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that might be really helpful in helping you to think about how you answer your questions, or why, even if you wrote lots and lots and lots, why you might not have got a lot of marks. Just remember that if you're not using your case studies and you're not evaluating, you're locking yourself out of AO2 and AO3. So this is the first one. She'll come back here before we start. So I've got 3 examples here. 2 of them were given, they're all level 3 examples, they're all detailed examples. 2 of them were given a 7, and the last one was given a 9. They all do something just a little bit different, and they all use different strategies, so that you can have a look at what you've done. And compare it and use them to help you focus your dirt. So the first one talks about tourism. This was I quite liked this one because it talks about how tourism is not very effective, and it spends the rest of the answer talking about how tourism, although it can have an impact, it can be good for a country, as it talks about down here about the impact tourism on Jamaica's GDP. Ultimately, tourism is very vulnerable if there's a recession, so people don't go and visit that place anymore. Tourism is seasonal and long term, and that a lot of the companies that operate in countries that rely on tourism are often not based in that country to start with, so lots of the income leaves. So this one was quite good. The only thing that would have really helped was a bit more detail particularly around economic recession and just the worries around countries becoming dependent on tourism, but also some more around the evaluation. So maybe a statement at the end that talked about, so here, just a statement at the end that kind of wrapped the whole argument up. And also maybe because we have used, because we know that Jamaica has been quite successful, has used tourism quite successfully to help reduce this development gap. Maybe an example of a country where tourism hasn't worked so well, or where it has been really negatively affected by, say, an economic recession. So when I'm talking about ways that this answer could be improved to give it full marks, I keep saying maybe, and that's because, as you can see, and as you've seen from all of the mark schemes, they're not looking for word perfect answers. They're looking for certain types of geographic thought and geographic skills, and there are a number of ways that you can do that in your answers. So, bear in mind that when we give you feedback, it's not about memorizing that particular piece of information and then repeating it back in the future. It's about long-term progress, developing your geographic thought. So, yeah, as I said, this answer got a 7, and it could have improved it by providing a final evaluative statement. It could have improved it by providing an example of when when tourism hasn't been so successful for a country, when they've been hit by some of these negatives that have been highlighted, um, and perhaps talking more about how countries may become dependent on tourism. Okay, this one here again. Pause the video so that you can read through the answers. The students talked about aid. What they've done really, really well is they've shown that they've got a really deep understanding of what aid is. They've got a really thorough understanding and knowledge of aid. They make that clear before then focusing on a particular type of aid. So they've acknowledged other types. They've focused on a particular type, so charitable aid, practical action, or Oxfam, and then has talked about why these are used. So they donate resources to LICs. They tend to improve the quality of life for individuals. And then talked about Oxfam in particular. And there's some repetition in this answer that doesn't necessarily need to be there. But what it does is it clearly links the impact that international aid has on LICs, because we're using a case study of a specific charity rather than a country. Um, it's okay. Like they haven't lost marks. They haven't not received marks because of that, because they've used Oxfam really, really clearly. I would say that talking about Oxfam's impact on one particular place, Malawi, Kenya, um, would would take it probably up to the full 3 marks for that assessment objective. Um, but where this question could have been developed more, this answer could have been developed more, um, is looking more at the impact of either safe and clean water to really show understanding of how development works, and how kind of that multiplier effect of development, of when you make some improvements in one place, they have these flow-on improvements elsewhere. But in the evaluation here, they've said aid's not as effective as other strategies. They've talked about why it's effective, but it's not as effective as other strategies. They haven't talked about why it's not as effective. And what I would suggest here is, because this could be a whole nother page worth of writing talking about or explaining why aid isn't as effective as other strategies, maybe looking at specific reasons why aid might not be effective. Is it that countries can become reliant on it? Is it that it relies on charitable donations from nice rich people in HICs? What are some of the flaws with the aid system, rather than trying to compare it to all of the other strategies? So I'd say that those are some of the reasons why this didn't get full marks, but I did think that it shows the kind of knowledge really, really well, and it makes quite a good use of a specific case study to really, really tightly link it back to how it can improve a country's development to reduce the development gap. Okay, we're now going to look at the 9-mark, at the answer that received 9 marks. It is very long. I don't suggest that you write an answer like this long. But what it does really, really well is it focuses on one case study, and it talks about how the Kuapa Kuku project in Ghana has shown that fair trade can reduce a country's development gap. So if you pause the video and you can just read through what is a very good analysis of how well fair trade has helped close the development gap in Ghana through through this project. Um, what they've also done here is they've given two positives of the project. They've given a negative, so there's some disadvantages, um, in that only cocoa farmers benefit from it. So it doesn't directly benefit everyone. But then they've quite cleverly gone and said, but that it might have indirect benefits. So although people don't benefit directly from this, from the Koapa Kuku Cooperative, because they are paying taxes, because they're investing in local development projects, then you're getting schools and you're getting all that local infrastructure, which is helping to improve Ghana's development and helping to reduce the development gap. So, um, as I said, this answer's quite, it's long. You shouldn't be thinking of 9 mark answers in terms of how much you have to write, but this is a very detailed, very robust answer that might also help you if if you are struggling to still wrap your head around fair trade. So, I hope that that has been useful for you. I hope that you now have some points that you can use to work on your answers from your own test. If you have any questions, send me an email about it, particularly if you are curious about particular answers that you gave and marks. Um, it may be that Mr. Davidson is a nicer marker than me. If you'd like to contest anything like that. So, um, have a good week. I hope that helped. If you have any questions, send me an email. Yeah.